Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host, Mitch. Glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. Today we have an episode of Commander's 2 Cents. On episodes like these, I give you my own personal take on topics about the format in general and current news. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And while you're at it, subscribe and review our podcast as well. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about Commander cards that dominate games. Now, when I'm talking about these cards, essentially I'm talking about cards that are bombs that when they come down, they make a huge impact and can really swing the game into one player's favor. The card needs to be dealt with pretty much immediately or the game might be very close to ending. The game more or less becomes completely about that specific card when it hits the table. Now, obviously the cards that I choose for this episode are completely based off my opinion. I might think that a certain card dominates games and you don't, and that's okay. I'm also going to be only listing 10 cards in this episode, and there are definitely more out there that can dominate games. But these 10 especially stood out to me as ones that can really turn a game on its head. And one more thing really quick before I get a ton of comments on, well, you didn't include Expropriate. Like I said, these cards need to be dealt with immediately, so that means that they're sticking on the table. Something like Expropriate just wins you the game. It doesn't really dominate a game, it just wins. There's a slight difference. Anyway, just bear with me. Also, these are in no particular order, so I'm not ranking them on this one's more dominant than another one is. It really depends on your playgroup and your meta, so you can decide that for yourself. So with all that nonsense out of the way, let's get into it. And today's first card that absolutely can dominate games is Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite, a 4/7 Praetor with Vigilance that costs 5 white. She's got very simple text. She says, other creatures you control get +2/+2, and creatures your opponents control get -2/-2. This is both an anthem and a anti-anthem, and it's a huge swing. Essentially, if you're taking the plus and the minus together, that's a 4 power and toughness jump. If you had a bunch of small creatures on the board, congrats, they're much bigger now. If your opponent's got some big creatures on the board, congrats, they're much smaller now. And if you've got an opponent playing a small token deck, they're very sad. Not only are their small tokens dead, but chances are they can't create any while this is out. In the vast majority of games, if this comes out, it has a huge impact. It can turn a game that is very much not in your favor into one that is in an instant. If not dealt with, that 4 power and toughness swing that this provides can absolutely take over the game and finish it off for you. So I definitely feel that Elesh Norn deserves a spot in this list. As does another one of our buddies with Vorinclex Voice of Hunger. Vorinclex is a 7/6 Praetor with Trample that costs 6 green. He has whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produced. And whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, that land doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So essentially this doubles up your mana while also kind of cutting your opponent's mana in half. If your opponents tap out to cast some things, they're essentially time walking themselves because their lands aren't going to untap. This is an absolutely brutal fact, and if this hits the table and it's not dealt with very quickly, your opponents are going to be in big trouble. Having a huge mana advantage generally leads to victory, and this easily provides that. Now, according to EDH Rec, this is actually one of the saltiest cards that there is. So although it dominates games, you might not have too many friends after you play this. Now, obviously that depends on your group, but again, just think twice before you decide to play this one. It can definitely win you games, but it can also lose your friends. But let's move on to another card that gives incredible mana advantage with Nyxbloom Ancient. This is actually a new card from Theros Beyond Death, and it is already making waves in Commander. It's a 5/5 enchantment creature elemental with trample that costs 4 green. It says if you tap a permanent for mana, it produces 3 times as much of that mana instead. Now, we've had plenty of mana doublers in Magic, and those are seen as very powerful in Commander. But to my knowledge, this is the first mana tripler, which is definitely cranking it up a notch and taking things a step further. Also, the way that this is worded, it works differently than something like Vorinclex. Essentially with Vorinclex, it only affects lands and just gives you 1 extra mana no matter what that land is. This one triples the amount that any permanent produces. So let's say that you've got one of the bounce lands which taps for 2, congrats, that now taps for 6. Regardless, this is an incredibly powerful effect and gives you an absurd mana advantage over all of your opponents. Although it's a new card, I've already seen it dominate a fair share of games. It comes down, gets stolen, gets cloned by its own owner, just crazy things happen. The amount of advantage that it gives you is absurd, and people recognize that the second it hits the table. Also, with cloning, a quick rules note. The effects of multiple Nyxbloom Ancients are cumulative. For example, if you have 2 Nyxbloom Ancients on the battlefield, you'll get 9 times the original amount and type of mana. Essentially, if you clone this once, congrats, your basics tap for 9 mana. Yeah, that can probably take over a game. Anyways, moving on to another impactful card with Omniscience. It's an enchantment that costs 7 blue, 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 and it says you may cast spells from your hand without paying their mana costs. So essentially, who needs all that mana from Nyxbloom Ancient when you can just cast things for free? Yeah, this thing hitting the board is going to immediately swing the game into that player's favor. You want to try to do anything against them? They've got free counter spells. That 12 mana Blightsteel Colossus in their hand? It's free. And speaking of Blightsteel Colossus, I probably should have had it in this list, but I didn't for today, and that's okay, so don't comment on that. Yeah, casting things for free is pretty broken. If you've got draw spells or tutors, you can usually just win the game from there, and it's very hard to stop. Once this hits the table, your opponents basically have to all team up to try to stop you, and they still might not be able to. Just a very powerful card that obviously can really dominate a game. Speaking of casting things for free, let's talk about Lurking Predators. It's an enchantment for 4 and a green, and it says whenever an opponent casts a spell, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, put it onto the battlefield, otherwise you may put that card on the bottom of your library. In Commander, it's essentially a guarantee that your opponents are gonna cast spells. And some decks especially like to cast a ton of spells. So every time they decide to do that, you get to reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, you get it into play for free. Now that could be something as small as a Mana Dork, or it could be again Blightsteel Colossus, which isn't on this list for some reason. But in all seriousness, with the right deck, this card can absolutely dominate the game. In just one turn around the table, if this isn't dealt with and your opponents are still casting spells, you can get a ton of huge beaters off the top. And if you've got some ways to manipulate the top of your library, congrats, this does even more work for you. Let me just brainstorm this Ulamog on top, and yeah, go ahead and cast whatever you want. Again, this one definitely requires the right deck and setup, but this is an absolutely game-changing card. Another game-changing card that requires pretty much no setup is Consecrated Sphinx. It's a 4/6 flying Sphinx that costs 4 blue blue. It's a very simple card. It just says whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards. So much like ramping, drawing cards in Commander is good. You've got 3 opponents who at the very least are going to draw 1 card each turn, so that's 6 cards every time around the table thanks to this. The amount of card advantage that this can give you just by staying in play is absolutely absurd. If it's not dealt with quickly, the lead that you can gain from this can be absolutely insurmountable. Again, the second this hits the table, everyone's either going to want to get rid of it, or clone it, or steal it. Because the advantage that this can give you for just staying on the table is incredible. But let's talk about a card that goes in the complete opposite direction of this with Sire of Insanity. It's a 6/4 demon that costs 4 black-red, and it says at the beginning of each end step, each player discards their hand. So that Sphinx might draw you some cards, but they're just going to go away every single turn. This card can be absolutely brutal, and if it's not immediately dealt with, it definitely changes the game. Once you hit that first end step, everyone's on the exact same page with no cards in their hand. Control decks or decks that like to stick back are going to have a bad day if they can't deal with this. Now, a lot of decks generally don't run this, but the decks that do can work around this effect. They may have some cards that they can cast in their graveyard, or ways to draw extra cards each turn and then cast those right away, so on and so forth. So the disadvantage that this gives other players is going to be much greater than the disadvantage it gives them. Regardless, this game can definitely turn a game on its head just by hitting that first end step. And if it sticks around, its effect can be absolutely brutal against a ton of decks. But let's go in a different direction with the next pick though, with Wound Reflection. It's an enchantment for 5 and a black, and it says at the end of each turn, each opponent loses life equal to the life they lost this turn. So yeah, this effectively doubles up all the bad things that happen to your opponents. They take some combat damage in a turn, yep, doubles that. They shock themselves with a shock land, yeah, that's 4 damage instead of 2. Or you just cast Exsanguinate for 20, and yeah, now it's 40 and everyone's dead. This card definitely changes the way that people play as soon as it hits the board. It basically makes your opponents die twice as quickly. So yeah, I would say that this dominates games, especially if it's not dealt with right away. But now let's talk about a somewhat similar enchantment with Havoc Festival. It's an enchantment for 4 black and a red, and it says players can't gain life. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player loses half their life rounded up. This is most definitely a clock, especially since it doesn't allow players to gain life. This is a clock on every single player, even the player that cast it. But depending on where you're sitting, that clock's going to be slightly faster or slower for you. Losing half your life on your upkeep is a huge hit to take every single turn. Going from 40 to 20 to 10 to 5 in absolutely no time means that the game is going to end pretty quickly. The second this hits the table, everyone's going to have to stop and do some quick math in their head. Essentially, their thoughts are, how many turns do I have to live? And yeah, I need to get rid of that as soon as possible. And the final card that I'm going to bring up today that can dominate games is Rorikthar the Unbowed. Rorikthar is a 6/6 Ogre Warrior with Vigilance and Reach that costs 4 red-green. He attacks each combat if able, and whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, Rorikthar deals 6 damage to that player. 6 damage for each and every single non-creature spell is a ton of damage. If you're at your starting life total, one spell takes 15% of your life. This definitely changes the game and makes players think twice on casting certain spells before this is dealt with. Now, Rorikthar kind of helps players out by giving them a way to remove it without having to cast anything. Because it has to attack each combat if able, there's a chance that it might die in combat. But the player who casts Rorikthar probably has some ways to protect it, or ways to tap it before combat, so on and so forth. It's gonna punish some players. The amount of damage that this can deal out in one game is absolutely absurd, and it can definitely take over the game the second it hits the table. But with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what card that you think dominates games. And make sure you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Again, a huge thank you to my patrons who help make this show possible. I truly couldn't do any of this without your support. If you want to support this channel directly, consider becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There are even tiers where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. You can check out all the Patreon tiers and rewards at patreon.com/commandersquarters. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.